Welcome to Brainwaves and Breakthroughs.
Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be tackling something you do every day probably without even thinking about it. It's small talk. And we've got a really fascinating mix of sources for you today. We've got practical business advice, some historical perspectives, and even some psychological studies. So get ready, because we're about to uncover the hidden power and the surprising depth of those, seemingly insignificant conversations.
You know, what's fascinating to me here is that small talk is so often seen as just filler. But you know what? Our sources reveal that it's so much more than that. Think of it this way. It's like the WD-40 of social interaction. It just helps things move smoothly.
I'll admit, I used to think of small talk as just that, small. But to think it has such deep roots, that's kind of a game changer for me.
You're absolutely right. The roots of small talk go all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. We're talking Plato and Socrates here, debating those big ideas, but also engaging in casual conversation as just a way to build community. It was something that was highly valued, both for exploring intellectual concepts and simply connecting with other humans.
So those awkward attempts, the office coffee machine, are actually carrying on an ancient philosophical tradition. I kind of love that.
Exactly. And it's not just ancient history either. Think about a modern day business networking event. Imagine trying to pitch $1 million idea to somebody without that initial warm-up of small talk.
Yeah, I think I'd make a beeline for the exit if somebody just skipped the small talk and launch right into their pitch.
One source even calls small talk a social lubricant. And it's for that very reason. It helps us ease into those interactions, reduce that initial awkwardness, and kind of test the waters before we dive into those deeper topics.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we instinctively use those safe, low-stakes topics to kind of build trust gradually.
Precisely. On a psychological level, small talk helps us navigate all the uncertainty of social situations. It signals our willingness to connect, and it helps us figure out, if the other person's on the same wavelength, without the pressure of revealing too much too soon.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. One of the psychology articles actually claims that small talk can boost our mood and even improve our brain function.
It's true. Even at this basic level, social interaction triggers the release of endorphins, those feel-good chemicals, so a little bit of chit-chat can actually make us feel happier and even think more clearly.
So small talk is like a mental workout. With a happiness boost, I am definitely rethinking my stance on small talk.
And if we dig a little deeper into the psychology here, there's this fascinating concept called the reciprocity principle. And it basically means that when we share something about ourselves, even something small, it encourages the other person to reciprocate. It's a fundamental part of how we build connections.
Okay, so even mentioning, weekend plans subtly nudges the other person to open up a little bit. But is there a risk of oversharing, in that initial reciprocity phase? Where's the line?
That's a great question. And you know what? It leads us perfectly into the practical advice.
Yeah.
On how to actually make small talk work for you. In part 2 of this deep dive, we're going to explore some specific techniques and tips to make your small talk more engaging and more effective.
We've uncovered the why behind small talk, but in part 2, we'll dive into the how. Stay tuned.
So are you ready to level up your small talk game? Good.
Yeah.
Because these sources are packed with actionable insights to help you do just that.
Let's do it. I'm already starting to see small talk in a whole new light, like some kind of secret code I'm finally cracking. But where do we even begin?
Well, one of the most valuable pieces of advice I found is to be more intentional with your small talk. Instead of just going through the motions with those, generic questions and responses, really try to engage more genuinely, listen actively, and kind of steer the conversation towards something meaningful, even if it starts small.
I love that. And you know what? I actually remember those tips from one of the sources about actually upgrading our small talk questions. Instead of just asking, how was your weekend? Try something like, what was the most interesting thing you did this weekend?
Exactly. That subtle shift. It invites a more thoughtful response. And it just opens the door to a more engaging conversation. It shows the other person that you're actually interested in what they have to say. You're not just filling the silence.
Right. And that actually brings us back to the that reciprocity principle we were talking about.
Yeah.
By showing genuine interest, you're more likely to get a genuine response in return. But how do we strike that balance between showing interest and, accidentally prying into someone's personal life? During those initial exchanges,
Ah, yes. The fine art of the delicate dance. It's all about reading the cues and respecting boundaries. Open-ended questions are your best friend here. They invite the other person to share as much or as little as they're comfortable with.
okay, so instead of asking, what did you do this weekend?
Wow.
Which could put someone on the spot. If they had a quiet weekend, we could try something like, what's been keeping you busy lately? That feels a little less intrusive.
Precisely. And don't underestimate the power of active listening. Really pay attention to what the other person is saying. Ask follow-up questions. Make eye contact. All those nonverbal cues, they speak volumes about your level of engagement.
It's like we're laying the groundwork for a stronger connection, even in those,
Yeah.
seemingly fleeting moments.
Exactly. Small talk, when done well, can be a genuine act of connection. A way to find common ground and build rapport.
And that's something we can all benefit from, whether it's in our personal relationships or our professional lives. Speaking of professional settings, one of the sources highlighted how small talk can be particularly beneficial in the workplace. It can help build trust among colleagues, foster a more positive work environment, and even spark new ideas.
That's so true. And one of the things I found really fascinating was the discussion of cultural differences in small talk.
Yeah.
One source pointed out how, here in the U.S., we tend to embrace small talk as a way to break the ice. But in some cultures, like certain Asian cultures, for example, it can be viewed as less important or even intrusive.
Yeah, it's like those unwritten rules of social etiquette. They vary from place to place. And being aware of those differences is crucial, especially in today's globalized world.
Absolutely. Cultural fluency is key to navigating these subtle social dances. It's about being adaptable and sensitive to the context, observing how others approach small talk, and adjusting your own style accordingly.
So we've talked about the historical roots of small talk, the psychological benefits, and even the cultural nuances. But there's still one nagging question in my mind. If we dismiss small talk as, meaningless chatter, are we missing out on something bigger? Like, could it actually be a form of empathy in disguise?
Ooh, I love that thought. And it perfectly sets up the final part of our deep dive. After a short break, we'll explore that very question. If small talk is more than just idle chatter, if it's actually a practice in empathy and connection, how might that change how we approach these everyday conversations?
We're back and ready to wrap up this deep dive into the surprisingly profound world of small talk. It's amazing how something we often dismiss as, as trivial can actually have, such deep roots and such far-reaching implications.
It really is. We often just rush through those small interactions, dismissing them as mere filler. But, in doing so, we might be missing out.
On valuable opportunities to actually connect on a human level. Yeah, it's like we get so caught up in the big picture, the important meetings, the life-changing decisions, that we forget those moments are often built upon a foundation of, smaller, more casual exchanges.
Think of it this way. You wouldn't try to build a house without first laying a solid foundation right. Small talk is like those foundational bricks, creating a sense of stability and trust, upon which more substantial connections can be built.
I love that analogy, and it really makes you realize that those seemingly insignificant conversations can actually lead to some pretty amazing things. New friendships, business partnerships, even romantic relationships. They often begin with a bit of small talk.
Absolutely. It's that initial spark, that first impression, which can set the stage for something truly meaningful. But it requires us to be present in those moments, to shift our focus from simply going through the motions, to genuinely listening, asking follow-up questions, and showing a sincere interest in what the other person has to say.
It's about treating those small interactions as opportunities to practice empathy, to learn something new about the world, and perhaps even brighten someone's day.
Precisely. And when we approach small talk with this mindset, we might discover that it's not just about exchanging pleasantries. It's about recognizing the shared humanity in each interaction, however fleeting it may be.
Thinking back to those historical and cultural perspectives, it becomes clear that the human need to connect, to find common ground, and to build social bonds has always been there. Small talk in its various forms has been the conduit for these connections throughout history.
Yet in our fast-paced, technology-driven world, we've somehow lost sight of its true value. We scroll through our phones, avoiding eye contact, and missing out on those small moments of human connection that make up the fabric of our lives.
But perhaps by understanding the history, the psychology, and the practical applications of small talk, we can reclaim that value and use it as a tool for building stronger connections, both personally and professionally.
It's about shifting our perspective, viewing small talk not as a chore, but as a chance to engage with the world around us, to practice empathy, and to cultivate meaningful connections, however small they may seem.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's remember those ancient philosophers, the psychological studies, and all those tips and tricks we've discussed today. But most importantly, let's remember that even in those seemingly insignificant moments of small talk, we have the power to make a positive impact.
And perhaps by approaching small talk with intention and awareness, we can transform those everyday interactions into something a little more meaningful, a little more human, and ultimately, a little more fulfilling.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the unexpected depths of small talk. We hope you've enjoyed exploring this often overlooked aspect of human connection with us.
Until next time, keep those conversations flowing. And remember, even the smallest interactions can have a ripple effect, creating a more connected and compassionate world.